They call it pink gold. Potash is a vital ingredient for growing food, and Canada has more of it than anywhere else in the world, with the largest reserves and production volume. It's now being touted as a secret weapon in this trade war with the United States.
A peaceful product that most people never gave much thought to unexpectedly made headlines in the summer of 2025. From being an industry secret to becoming the center of a global standoff, potash is a mineral that is extracted from the earth in Canada. For many years, it was the foundation of farming all across the world, concealed in plain sight among the fertilizers that sustain crops. Without it, entire nation security would be jeopardized along with maize fields, wheat harvests, and soybean yields. A once stable commerce became a battlefield when Washington placed a 35% tariff on Canadian potash on August 1st. The effects become unavoidable in a matter of days. Prices increased. The pinch was felt by farmers throughout the American heartland. Markets prepared for the repercussions as investors began to retreat. What had initially appeared to be a change in niche policy was now causing concerns about something much more significant. Was trade leverage the true issue here? Or had we entered a worldwide food crisis in its early stages? The consequences were severe and quick. The backbone of American farming was crushed by what appeared to be a line buried in Washington's tariff sheets. To maintain the fertility of its soil, the United States burns over 5 million tons of potash annually. However, the nation only produces about 400,000 tons, a small portion of that total. Nearly 90% of American imports come from Canada, with the remainder always coming from north of the border. When the tariff was imposed, the data spoke louder than words. Prices that were at $300 per ton by the spring of 2025 shot up to $340 in a matter of weeks. On paper, that change might have seemed technical, but for growers who measured each acre of wheat, soybeans, and maize, it was a devastating blow. The tiny margins that kept farm solvent started to disappear as fertilizer bills skyrocketed and input expenses skyrocketed. The Canadian behemoth at the heart of the supply chain, Nutrien, even issued a warning: American farmers will ultimately bear the brunt of the burden. The future became a single reality for producers in Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa, rising expenses with no end in sight. Was this a planned gamble that may push American farming toward collapse, or was it a plan to make it stronger? Frustration erupted in the Midwest as prices continued to rise without stopping. After years of enduring weather and market fluctuations, farmers now confronted a government policy that threatened to shatter them more quickly than flood or drought. In a rare and scathing letter, the National Farmers Union denounced the tax on behalf of tens of thousands of growers. It was a startling action that demonstrated how dire things had gotten. By September 2025, lime and fertilizer combined accounted for almost 7% of total production expenses. For many family farms, that seemingly insignificant figure marked the difference between survival and bankruptcy. Financial reports weren't the only source of suffering. Reduced yields in Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska have a long-term impact on the food supply. Furthermore, the impact of crop failure extends beyond the farm gate. As it expands, it raises the prices of meat, dairy, fruit, and vegetables, dragging customers into the same vicious cycle of financial hardship that started with a tariff drafted in Washington. The heartland of America was enraged, but Ottawa took a different approach. Canada chose not to impose retaliatory tariffs in the same way as the U.S. Instead, it started subtly changing its long-term plan while employing potash as a leverage weapon. Quotas, reserves, and targeted incentives became the new policy. This was particularly evident in Saskatchewan, which has the largest potash reserves in the world. In order to increase storage, construct emergency stockpiles, and establish a buffer robust enough to withstand shocks from abroad, the provincial government there initiated a scheme worth around $400 million Canadian dollars. By the middle of 2025, Canada's domestic reserves had grown to their biggest level in 5 years, sufficient to cover 2 full planting cycles without the need for imports. It was more than just a protective endeavor. By establishing leverage, it made it clear that Canada would not be cornered. The industry gained momentum along the way. More than 1,500 employment were created throughout Saskatchewan, boosting local economies and demonstrating that potatoes could be used as a growth engine and a safety net. Canada's subdued tactics had an impact much beyond its boundaries. Ottawa was creating the framework for a new global trade map while the US battled rising prices and angry farmers. In Asia, it made one of its most audacious pushes. Canada ensured its presence in two of the most demanding markets in the world by negotiating long-term fertilizer contracts with China and agricultural supply deals with India. These were no easy business transactions. They were vital lifelines that made sure Canada's resources would supply the world's most hungry markets in addition to its own farms. Momentum continued throughout Europe, where governments scrambled to stabilize the supply as they dealt with the shock of fluctuating food prices. In their initial discussions with Canadian officials, Germany, Poland, and the Netherlands viewed fertilizer as a vital component of food security rather than a commodity. Japan also wanted Canadian guarantees that it wouldn't be subject to unexpected shortages because of its vulnerable agricultural economy, which is highly reliant on outside supply. Every handshake and discussion demonstrated how Canada has turned the export of potash into a diplomatic tool. Even Mexico started reconsidering its supply lines closer to home. It was a sign of increasing interest in heading north to Canada after being chained to American chains for a long time. The change was not just an economic one for Mexico. It has to do with protecting oneself. By diversifying through Canada, there was a potential for stability as reliance on Washington's trade decisions had proven to be dangerous. It means creating a more stable basis for its own agricultural future while protecting its farmers from political uncertainty. By then, the tale that started with a single tariff line in Washington had altered the balance of power in fertilizer markets, stoked turmoil in America's breadbasket, and changed the dynamics of international trade. Spreadsheets and price charts were no longer the only tools used to raise the stakes. They had infiltrated family dinner tables, international politics, and food supply lines. Furthermore, one question could not be ignored when the policy shock waves evolved into long-term realignment. Was this the initial spark of an unanticipated food security problem, or was it a legitimate effort to safeguard American industry? It was impossible to ignore the change by now. Fertilizer gained a level of prominence that changed how governments, businesses, and investors assessed their exposure to food poverty when the G20 decided to designate it as a strategic resource, joining oil and natural gas. Canada was at the center of this change, controlling almost 40% of the world's potash production and possessing a kind of power few had anticipated from a nation more famous for its minerals, oil, and lumber. It was no longer possible to ignore the question: was the world witnessing the emergence of a new type of resource powerhouse, one based on the minerals that enable human sustenance rather than metals or fossil fuels? Canada's situation was very different from America's, which was dealing with a worsening agrarian crisis. Global cash started pouring into the potato industry, with investors who had previously placed their money into software companies, oil exploration, or speculative real estate suddenly viewing fertilizer as the most important resource for food security in a globe shook by trade disputes and tariffs. It was a stunning surge. The dramatic increase in shares of Canadian mining behemoths like Nutrien, which in some cases doubled in a matter of months, changed balance sheets and fueled aggressive development plans. Long regarded as a financial center connected to the energy markets, Toronto soon became the center of the world's mineral trade. Once based on crude oil futures, high-stakes negotiations now centered on fertilizer contracts that linked potash to government initiatives aimed at protecting their food supply for institutional investors, hedge funds, and sovereign wealth funds. The reasoning was obvious. Potash was no longer an ordinary vegetable. It served as defense against unpredictability. Analysts started to contend that fertilizer had joined the ranks of resources that influence not only markets but also the distribution of power in the world, such as oil, gas, and rare earths. This urgency is further emphasized by growing worries about population increase, supply disruptions, and climate volatility. Across Saskatchewan, billions of dollars were invested in expanded storage facilities, modernized processing plants, and new extraction locations. With new construction, hiring drives, and a revitalized feeling of purpose, Entire towns that had previously feared the boom and bust cycles of resource markets were suddenly prospering. Canada was being repositioned as the fertilizer equivalent of OPEC, a country whose resources were now vital to the global food chain. The change had deeper significance for Canadians. It went beyond economic expansion. It was an opportunity to tie national success to a resource that all nations require year after year. Potash had subtly developed into a basis of geopolitical power as well as a source of income. Originally intended as a levy to safeguard American agriculture, it ultimately created the precise circumstances that undermined it while elevating Canada to unprecedented levels of international significance. American farmers were still having difficulty by the end of 2025 as a result of tariffs that increased the price of potatoes by up to $100 a ton. Producers were left fighting for survival during another planting season as a result of that number being added to already constrained budgets and strained balance sheets. The farm was not the end of the squeeze. It spread throughout grocery stores across the country. After years of efforts by officials to control it, food inflation started to rise once more. The cost of vegetables, meat, and dairy increased, and regular families were forced to pay more for the same goods they had purchased just months before. What had been touted as a safeguard for homegrown businesses began to resemble an unseen tax that was eating away at household finances. Washington soon heard the pushback against the policy. Hearings on Capitol Hill were heated as senators argued on how to proceed. While some argued that lowering tariffs would help farmers, others cautioned that retreating would jeopardize more general trade objectives. Every session turned into a platform for the more profound dispute. If the economic burden that national self-sufficiency was imposing was worth it. As the costs increased and revealed fragility rather than strength, the phrase of self-reliance started to lose its charm. Rather than protecting American agriculture, the program emphasized how vulnerable it was when isolated from resources outside the nation's control.